So we are now about to start the second and last panel of this event, which will focus on the addictive design of digital services. And indeed, we have already heard references to this concept earlier in the day. We heard from the different members of parliament who referred to the recently adopted draft IMCO report on addictive design, which brought this topic very much to the agenda here today and has triggered broader policy discussions around what it means, this addictive design concept, and then what should be the EU's response. So that is what we are here to discuss today. As during the last panel, the audience will also have a chance to ask questions, so feel free to submit them already now, or as our panelists will be speaking. You can use the same hashtag, ADCE23, and we will read them out at the end. Similar to the last panel, we have a very good representation of different views on this panel. We have a representative of the consumer organization, business organization, academia, as well as the member state perspective. So starting then to my left, we have Francesco Bondi, who is a policy associate at Europe, representing some of the largest digital services providers. Next to him, we have Mark Laser, who is a professor at the Amsterdam Law and Technology Institute at VU Amsterdam. Then turning to my right, we have Kasper Draszewski, who is a senior legal officer at BEUC, the European Consumer Organization. And to my right, we also have Brian Wessel, who is the Deputy Permanent Secretary of Business and Legal Affairs in the Danish Ministry of Industry, Business and Financial Affairs. And myself, I'm Egelin Brown. I'm the team leader for digital and unfair commercial practices at DG Justice in the European Commission. And I'm coordinating the fitness check exercise. And just to give you an introduction to this topic here today, the fitness check has identified different kinds of concerns about interface designs in the online environment, including specifically functionalities and designs that induce digital addiction, or in other words, addictive design. And it is generally in the trader's economic interest to make sure that consumers spend as much time, money, and engagement as possible interacting with their products and services, especially if that trader's business model relies on processing consumer data. So making sure that there is as much data as possible generated by their use of their services. However, so this addictive use of digital services carries with it a risk of harm, not only economic harm to consumers, but also mental harm, possibly even physical harm, including but not confined to vulnerable consumers, such as children. And under the steer of Rapporteur Kim van Sparentak, who spoke earlier, the IMCO committee has, in its draft report, specifically asked for more to be done, and in particular, in terms of legislation to address these issues. And that is why the fitness check context is the perfect occasion to have now the first discussion on what may be needed. And it has also become clear that addictive design could potentially impact large segments of the EU population to some extent. For instance, in our public consultation for the fitness check, 33% of consumers who responded reported spending too much time or too much money using certain websites or apps. And likewise, in a representative consumer survey that we conducted for the fitness check with a sample size of 10,000 consumers in 10 member states, 31% reported spending more time or money than they intended because of specific features, such as the autoplay of videos or receiving rewards for continuous use, or conversely, or being penalized for inactivity or not using the digital service. So today's panel aims to discuss this very multifaceted topic of addictive design and everything related to it in the online interface design world, and hopes to give guidance on what should be the EU policy response to it. So I will start with the first round of questions to our panelists. It is very fitting that we will first start with Mark, giving us more the academic perspective. And so we would like for you to explain, first of all, what do we mean by addictive design? It is not at all obvious when you are hearing about this topic for the first time. Can you bring some examples of the types of design features that people are referring to when having concerns about addictive design? And are these different from so-called dark patterns, another topic that has been very much on the agenda in the past years, referring to these manipulative interface designs? So Mark, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Eglin, and thank you to everybody in the room for letting me present on this important topic. Simply put, addictive design is a means of describing, as an umbrella term, design techniques which are used to hook a user into an app, a service, or a platform. More specifically, it's a means of designing a digital service with strategic interface elements and algorithms that coalesce to engender habitual user engagement. And this design paradigm exploits innate psychological traits and behavioral economics to foster user dependency and to perpetuate platform interaction. And integral to this design ethos are mechanisms that induce a quasi-compulsive loop of consumption and interaction, akin to the variable reinforcement mechanisms that we see in gambling paradigms. Next slide. So there's three types I'm going to talk about in this very short reply. The first is profile-powered addictive design, or there's actually one which is digital interface addictive design. Next button, please. And that's at the surface of the iceberg. And then beneath the surface is profile-powered addictive design and AI-powered addictive design. And I'm going to briefly explain what I mean by all three of those. Next slide, please. So there, okay, and then the next slide. Okay, so the first is digital interface addictive design, and this method integrates design elements and features intentionally crafted to make users spend more time on a platform or application than they might have intended. And these designs exploit human psychology to create habits or even dependencies, often to increase user engagement, the time spent on the site, or frequency of use. This approach is generally prevalent on social media platforms, mobile applications, and online gaming environments. Now, not all of these are bad. Some of these are things that we've all experienced with our interactions on social media and digital platforms. They are designed, though, to create stickiness, a digital stickiness between users and platforms. And these include things like seamless scrolls and interactive alerts, dynamic rewards, playing on the social dynamics at play, and manipulation of content streams, for example, to influence together the temporal connections in the brain, and then throw in a hit of dopamine for good measure as well. And so we've all experienced these. These are the like buttons. These are the read receipt functions, is typing displays, the number of followers on a platform, the use of particular colors, push notifications, time-restricted content like temporary available stories. These are the things that we all now experience using social media and certain forms of apps. Next slide, please. The next category is profile-powered addictive design. And so rather than relying on the uniform deployment of digital interfaces with the aforementioned design techniques, platforms use profiling of psychological traits to induce addictive behavior. So rather than designing an interface to exploit psychological vulnerabilities, platforms first profile to identify exploitable psychological traits. And this personalized approach harnesses user data to unveil psychological characteristics. So tailoring the addictive experience based upon the user's personal data that they leave behind. And that method enhances the potency of the standard deployment of the first category of addictive design in the user interface. And that's infinite scroll and variable rewards aligned to particular individual susceptibilities. So we've all experienced these in some form, because if you tie addictive design elements to your profile, then recommender systems would fall under a means of profile-powered addictive design on the basis of certain personalized content. Profile-powered addictive design techniques include using user profiles to extend visit frequency and duration, amplify the platform attachment, leveraging intimate knowledge of user psyches, magnifying the vulnerabilities akin to gambling mechanisms, and employing gamification to mask compulsive cycles as user-led choices, and exploiting innate desires for our social connectivity and acceptance, actually leaving users with the illusion of control. This approach not only undermines autonomy, but it also risks significant psychological distress, as users are steered by the invisible, data-driven triggers tailored to our individual behavioral patterns. Next slide, please. The third category is AI-powered addictive design, and that is the combination of the previous two. Using addictive design techniques, profiling, and AI-powered design to discover your vulnerabilities and organize the environment unique to you in order to take advantage of those psychological traits. So imagine a recommender system algorithm using to drive content and rearrange and personalize the choice architecture to reflect a user's vulnerabilities at any given moment. And these techniques include AI algorithms meticulously analyzing user data to identify psychological vulnerabilities, digital landscapes dynamically restructuring to exploit those traits in order to heighten user engagement. In this sense, the personalization that we all know goes beyond content delivery because it tailors the very structure of user choices to reflect your identifiable weaknesses as a human being. And advanced algorithms then curate content to align with your personal preferences and then leverage those moments of susceptibility, maximizing user time on the platform. Now, to answer your third question, addictive design is different from dark patterns. They can overlap, but dark patterns are deceptive or manipulative design choices that trick users into making decisions that they might not have made had the information been made more transparent. And so while addictive design often aims to increase user engagement, dark patterns tend to focus more on the immediate benefits like sales, contracting, signing up, or even data collection. So hopefully that answers all three of those questions sufficiently.
Thank you so much. That was incredibly useful. And with that, you have touched upon not only some of these very concrete features that we have already referred to, like this infinite scrolling, but also some of the more system-level, broader manipulations, one could say, that could be taking place. And there is indeed this connection between addictive design on the one hand and the increased possibility of personalization, and with that also manipulation on the other hand. So thank you so much for that. I'll now pass the floor to Casper to give us more the consumer perspective. So what are concretely then the problems that consumers experience in practice, and are they really powerless against addictive design? Can't we rely on individual self-control to deal with some of these issues?
Thank you very much, Egelin. Hello, everyone. Thank you again for the kind invitation. What are the problems from a consumer protection perspective? Let's open with a look at the state of play. We have come to depend upon digital services in our lives. We need them on a daily basis, even if very often we don't fully understand their mechanics, or in other words, what is under the hood. Still, we use them, but very often we have little choice. Often we don't pay for them. Often we get the impression that they are free. This impression can be strengthened by the communication layer of the service provider. We all remember the Facebook case from a few years back, who got hit with a 5 million fine by the Italian authority for claiming that Facebook is free and forever will be. Clearly that wasn't very dissuasive, because we are now getting pop-ups telling us that if we click consent, I consent, we can continue to use Facebook for free. So just as means an example. But we are in a transaction. Our engagement, our attention are being monetized by the traders. We are paying a price. This price is not stated very clearly. We don't have a clear idea of what it is. We're also not being made aware of a long-term cost that we are paying. The externalities that this has towards our well-being, towards our mental health, towards our quality of life. There's an extensive catalog of these in the INI report on addictive design. So when you factor all that in, this is not a free service. This is something between smoking habit and a lifelong mortgage, because in the end you do need these services, like you need a roof over your head. So from a consumer law perspective, there are plenty of issues to address here. And the most comprehensive lens is probably that of unfair commercial practices law, which, as we know, has its roots in advertising law, tasked with delineating persuasion from manipulation of people's transactional decisions. So is scrolling through your news feed in your social media account, is it a transactional decision? The Commission's guidance tells us yes, and it's hard not to agree. You are trading your time, your engagement for the service being provided to you, and you are providing value to the service provider. Is your transactional decision being distorted? That's the question to ask here. Let's do a thought experiment for a moment. Let's pretend it's real money we're talking about. You're signing up for a service, let's say a TV platform, and you're told it's going to be free. Or the price is not mentioned at all, but there's nobody to ask, so and the terms of service tell you nothing of value, so you should just agree to it. And then it turns out you are being charged for it, but in ways which are hidden and make little sense to you. So you kind of accept things as they are. But then it turns out there are behavioral tricks happening, and Mark tells us they're very often subliminal and quite skillfully deployed to make you pay more than you initially wanted to or intended to or were able to agree to. And this is happening all over the place. In a recent survey by BEUC, 83% consumers said they spend more time on social media than they plan to. So that's a big number, however you want to look at it. So would this be fair if this was about money? Simple answer is no. So why should it be fair when it's about another currency and one that we should be very careful about? Are consumers powerless? In theory, no. You can delete your social media accounts. You can deny your children contact with cyberspace in all possible ways. You could undertake to read every privacy policy and every terms of service and monitor it for every change and update. You could look for inconsistencies with what the services are doing. You could file a complaint when you see a video platform gives you search results, but then it tries to drag you into rabbit holes to keep you scrolling and clicking instead of just getting what you came to get and leaving. So the practical answer is powerless. In practice, yes. During COVID, we've seen governments making social media platforms their main channels for crisis communication, and you simply had to have an account in order to be able to follow those announcements. We can talk further about information asymmetries, the inability to understand what's going on, but what matters is that consumers are caught between a system of services which is not treating them very fairly and an outdated framework of protections which are still for the most part, based on disclosure and consent. So the assumption that everything is largely fine as long as the consumer somewhere in the process had the opportunity to click agree and continue. So to close, we live in a world of very strong asymmetries of knowledge and power. This has already been flagged in the first panel. We can no longer stick to this type of thinking. We see changes, we see signs of a shift, which are great to see. We see the academic discussions about digital symmetry. We had the INI report on addictive design, the new guidance document we owe to the Commission. That could be an extremely helpful tool towards a safer future for consumers. The monumental undertaking that is the digital fairness fitness check. So let's just hope that this will mark the opening of a new chapter indeed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Casper, and I really appreciated also some of the parallels you drew, that addictive design is somewhere between smoking and a mortgage. It's a headline. So indeed, thanks so much. We have now heard a lot about the possible harms here and some hints as to how they should be tackled. I will turn now to Brian to give us a bit of the member state perspective. So what do you see as the main problems from the Danish perspective? And do you think that currently this EU legal framework or EU policy around this issue is sufficient? Is it adequate?
Thank you, Egelin, and good afternoon, everybody. It's nice to be here. I'm glad that we have experts, because you listed up 4 experts. I'm not an expert on this, but I've been advising politicians for many years on this issue, and that's why I would like to start. Not many years ago, 3, 4, 5, 6 years ago, big tech was all great. The digital was all great. But now there's a political discussion the last couple of years, also in Denmark, and therefore we set down an expert group to look at big tech and their influence and their business model, and they gave us a lot of good advice, and a lot of what they're advising on is part of the challenges we have here today. But I think the politicians in Europe and in Denmark are admitting that they are playing catch-up here. I've been regulating business, or helping regulate business for 20 years, and normally you regulate, you have a dialogue, and then they change things. They have a compliance, and then they change things. This is a different ball game. This is catch-up of things that we are depending on, as you so rightly put it in with many good pictures. And therefore, it is catching up. And I think we are catching up in Europe. And I think what the Commission and the Member States Parliament did with DSA and DMA the last couple of years is really, really helpful. But there are still things that needs to be done. And I'll comment on some of them now as we see them, what should be next. I have 3 main points. One is, as you also mentioned, Casper, that there is this digital asymmetry between business and consumers, and we must look at the rules to see how they fit these new challenges. Then we have an enforcement issue in the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive. Some of the things you mentioned, is it a transaction? And we should clearly address them. I think there are things to be done there from an enforcement point of view that we could do, but I'll go into more details with that. And then there might be some things that we have to prohibit as well, like loot boxes to protect our minors. So enforcement, prohibitions, and then generally making it more fit to this digital asymmetry that we have. As it's been already said by experts, a lot more with a lot more expertise than I have, these interfaces are designed to ensure a continued engagement by consumers through these retention mechanism, addictive designs, and other persuasion practices. And it's more challenging than ever. I think the framework that we have was set up in a different time where you can make informed choices, and this is not really the case anymore. So there is this asymmetry, and we must reflect this in our rules. I think, as I already mentioned, I know the Commission is working hard at this. The committee in Parliament has some really good thoughts on this, and we look forward to have that with the fitness check of consumer legislation and digital fairness. The unfair, as I mentioned, the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive is the relevant place to look. And so I think there's a mix between what we already have that's not being enforced in the way that it could, and then new things that we should look at. But as in other areas, like with GDPR, with DSA coming, if we really enforce it together in Europe and with the Commission as lead, a lot can be done with the framework we already have. In this Unfair Commercial Practices Directive, I think you mentioned it also, Casper, this digital consumer-trader relationship. We have a trader that has access to a very detailed profile of a consumer, and that makes consumers vulnerable, and to a much different extent than it used to be when we wrote these rules. And this concept of the average consumer as a reasonably well-informed and reasonable person, it should instead reflect this asymmetry that we now have. So it's a different situation. So there's some definitions to be made in that. And then on economic behavior and transactional decisions that Casper also already mentioned to some extent, we will recommend from Denmark that this wide scope of economic behavior and transactional decision is reflected in the rules. So if we broaden these definitions, we will clarify that, for instance, scrolling on a social media platform is also regarded as a transactional decision, and this would address infinitive scroll and autoplay, some of the things that Marcus mentioned. It should be clear that this situation where the business model of the trader is built on the user's engagement, that this is within the scope of the directive. I don't think that's clear either today. So this would be the case when the trader's revenue is generated on the basis of the length and level of activity of consumer engagement. For instance, social media platforms provide unpaid access for consumers, but monetize consumer interactions with the platform. So that should be a economic behavior and a transactional transaction. And then finally, obligations to a fair and safe design. The obligation to design fair and safe user interfaces needs to be addressed more clearly to strengthen our enforcement, as I mentioned. And it should be considered whether certain practices should be subject to a reverse burden of proof, especially for practices that are an expression of digital asymmetry. And then finally, as I mentioned, we have a specific issue here with our minors and these loot boxes and what we have in gaming. I think some of this should be set in a different default situation, perspective, or maybe prohibited in some cases, and that could be done as well. So I think that sort of hopefully overviews where we aim to go with 26 other member states and the Commission and Parliament.
Yes, thank you so much. That was already incredibly helpful, going really to the details also of the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive and some of the definitions therein, like the concept of a transactional decision. And indeed, there were also some connections made to the topics of the previous panel, which indeed went into detail about the rules on the burden of proof in complex cases, and also this fairness by design or compliance by design principle. So to wrap up our first round of questions, I'm going to now turn to Francesco. You are here representing the industry side, so it's only fair to ask, do you agree that all of the practices that have been labeled here as addictive design are really problematic? And could you give examples of what companies are currently doing to address some of these problems around digital addiction?
Yeah, thank you so much, Eglin, for the invitation, first of all, and just widely to the European Commission for, I think, starting this debate, which is, from our side, a very important one and on a nascent topic nonetheless. So thank you for that. I think if you'll allow me just to react to the previous points very briefly, I promise. I can't react to everything, so I'll try to, I think, touch upon a few important things from our side in terms of considerations. One, Dr. Leiser mentioned very importantly the potential side effects of some of the features, which is an important aspect to consider. I think what's missing there is also the fact that these features are not inherently bad, in a sense. There are also, let's say, user expectations and user requests that we need to fulfill. So just portraying them as inherently bad, I think, is just starting from a very initial point and from potentially a wrong premise. In terms of the discussion on timing of how much time people spend on the services, again, here, I would just mention, I think for the consideration of the group as well, is it time the issue or what we're doing on the platforms? That's the issue. I think for us it's very important, obviously it's very important for us that consumers enjoy their experience, not simply mindlessly going through different aspects. So for us it's really I think easily portraying it as a question of time is too easy. I think what we really need to focus on is what the consumers are doing on the platforms and if they're getting the best experience possible from the platforms. And then just to wrap up and the reactions quickly. In terms of continued engagement, I think here I'd mention, I think we recognize that, you know, as businesses, we do try to engage our consumers and our users. I think that's a fair and legitimate request from our side. I'd have to say there is a difference between encouraging engagement with the use of our platforms and actively working towards, let's say, an addictive use of our platforms. So just to react, and then happy to discuss, obviously. But in terms of the reaction from our side, I think there's three main points that I wanted to bring across today. One being on the need to define the scope of the discussion further. Two, on the need to inject specificity into the discussion. And three, I've been tasked with providing some industry responsive examples, so happy to tackle that as well. In terms of the scope of the discussion, I think we see one major distinction that may be missing from the debate is, one is obviously the assumption that we design our services in such a way to lead directly to addiction, which, as you may imagine, I think we question. And I think the malintent here has not been proven, and I don't believe it will be proven because, again, from our side, we don't have this malintent. I think that's an important point. The second part, and this is, I think, researchers also sort of follow this line to a certain extent, is the problematic use or misuse of the services, which I think is very important to speak about as well. So it may seem like splitting hairs. That's a fair remark. But I think if we continue the discussion, which I hope we will, I think we really need to get the scope of the discussion right. Also for the researchers taking on board this task of researching these topics, I think they need to know exactly what we're asking of them. In terms of the second point on injecting specificity into the discussion, I think here it's really important. Obviously, there's been a focus on social media. That's one part of the industry. That is also included within our membership, but within our membership you also have many other, let's say, business models and services. So I think from our side, I think what the discussion would really benefit from is to take into account these different business models and services. And that's just because each business model, each different service has their own challenges, very specific and tailored challenges. And obviously I think it's important that we consider in the discussion how we tailor potential solutions to those challenges. Simply, you know, overarching, sweeping statements, you know, they won't necessarily work in this context, in all contexts at least. And then finally, in terms of what the industry response has been, I think here it might be almost controversial, but I'm quite proud of what industry has done. It's not that we've been reacting to the discussion, which again is very nascent within the policymaking field to a certain extent. I think we've been proactive in our approach. We've been taking as much as possible a holistic approach. For us, it's very important that we involve all stakeholders. That was our main request. Obviously, we have a lot of experts. I think we were discussing with Dr. Leiser, I think it would benefit also from the perspective of parents, healthcare professionals, schools, teachers, and so on and so forth. So again, that's why I hope the discussion will continue. I think one premise to make here is, you know, consumers obviously have legislation as one way to bring change. I think for us, the real driver of change are consumers. As you may be very well aware, for us, reputation is key. It's easy to lose and harder to regain. So obviously, I think we place a massive amount of importance on the experience that consumers have on our platform. And then just to quickly wrap up, in terms of practical examples of what we've been doing, I think that's to an extent why I'm proud. I think they really tackle all the issues that were brought up and also by the different studies that came up. So for example, one being in terms of prevention, a lot of our services and a lot of our members go actively into schools, for example, and work with NGOs and work with teachers to present the service to potential consumers and also highlight potential dangers of using the service. So I think that's one important point. Within the companies themselves, we also have internal audit systems. So it's not that we just decide to release a service and it's released. We also obviously debate with healthcare professionals and experts in the field to first test what they believe might be the impact on our users. And then we obviously balance the scales there. I think another important point, you know, this is key as well as parental controls. But parental controls from our side are really a balance to be struck between the right of privacy of the user, especially, and the rights of parents, obviously, to engage with their children and make sure that they're engaging with the services in a safe way. So I think here it's the approach we've taken, at least, is really to start a discussion between parents and children. Obviously, not to say that we place the entire burden on parents, but I think we all have a role to play, and I think parents would be a key parent is that. And then more granular-wise, we mentioned the like buttons, for example. Several of our members also, hide the ability to see likes, as an example. Or there's nudges in the evening, for example, when you believe maybe it's time to go to bed or you have school the next morning or anything like that. So again, I think if I may leave you with one thing, is it's not black and white. It doesn't have to be good or bad. There are safeguards we can implement, and there's middle grounds we can find. But again, I'm happy to be here and happy to discuss as much as possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and indeed for listing some of the very concrete tools and things that are out there that can already be used by parents, but also by adults for themselves. On that note, I heard also from Brian a reference to children and protection of minors being particularly important. So I'll turn back to Mark with a follow-up question then. Are certain groups of consumers, such as children, more prone to be victims of these addictive designs? And if so, how can we make sure that this interface design or the online experience that children have is a positive one?
Thank you very much, and two great questions. So I basically come up with 6 sort of short heuristics to kind of explain why this is so problematic for children. And first is the proliferation of digital devices. I mean, this is a generation alpha, I guess it is now, where they get devices and access to devices from the youngest ages possible, which are making them more susceptible to these types of designs in the first place. It then becomes axiomatic that children lack the maturity to detect a dark pattern or to detect a form of digital design, or to even understand that excessive screen time might be affecting their sleeping habits or exposing them to bad or dangerous content. And sometimes it's not even enough to say, because the adults don't recognize them. I run the Deceptive Design website with Harry Brignall, who coined the term dark patterns, and we're constantly finding dark patterns which is fooling adults. So that lack of cognitive maturity certainly is going to affect children who have an inherent vulnerability. And here, even those without sort of active parental mediation, are inherently vulnerable to these designs. They're so insidious that they still cause harm. The fourth thing that I think is worthwhile exploring is that often, and thankfully, gratefully, we talk about parental controls, but that starts at a place that every parent of every child in the European Union is actively participating in the raising of their child in the same way as every other parent in the European Union. So they presume a sort of normative parental arrangement. It doesn't take into consideration the cultural, socioeconomic differences that affect every child across the EU. And when you take those factors together and think about the gamification of some platforms and the way that they're designed to exploit children for an ex post benefit, what I mean by that is, give us your personal data now. We might not make an immediate profit out of it, but we'll have it at a later date that we can then use to monetize and bring back benefits to the platform. And the final sort of shorthand problem, I think, is that there's regulatory deficiencies in the digital design acquis of the European Union. My collaborator, Cristiana Santos, and I wrote a paper pointing this out, in that there's little gaps in coverage of protection, not even for children, for grown-ups as well. Article 25 in particular of the DSA only regulates online interfaces, and so anything that's kind of beneath the surface or a very deep or dark pattern would be unregulated at the present, considering Article 25. So I would say that that collection of sort of 6 or 7 ideas is unsatisfactory to protect the most vulnerable groups in our society, especially children. Now, how do we then fix this problem? Well, the first is we need to move away from dark patterns and thinking about dark patterns and move towards legislative measures that think about deceptive design. And that's one of the reasons why Harry and I changed the website from darkpatterns.org to deceptive.design, was to sort of think about those design features existing above, below, and very deep inside the system architecture. We need to stop thinking of that as only an issue of online interface. We need to widen the material scope and think about design in the system architecture. Thirdly, we need to think about what we mean when we talk about the personal scope, like who is actually going to be protected. And for me, as a regulatory theorist, as an academic, the EU's approach of compartmentalizing everything into data protection and the data subject, and the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive, and the consumer, and even electoral reform, and the voter, means that we don't think about these problems necessarily holistically in the way that we should in order to provide active and meaningful and effective user protection. And I think this is an opportunity, if we're thinking about regulating addictive design, that we have a broadening of the personal scope for a more user-centric approach to protection rather than just compartmentalizing things like consumers. And then having a sort of sense of pluralistic rules that can be applied to all aspects of that design. I would also move away from this impact assessments, which is kind of an ex-ante approach to looking about how you envisage an impact on a child, to a design audit, where experts, computer scientists, social scientists, psychologists can come in and actually look at a platform and think about the potential of the user interface, the user experience, and the whole system, and how that might unduly influence, manipulate, or deceive a child. These should be done by outsiders and experts on an ongoing basis. I would also think about independent oversight to investigate grievances, impose penalties, and often policy enhancement suggestions. And then when it comes to education, I would think about educational initiatives for children. We don't often include children when we talk about policy, and it's good to have children and give them a voice, let them participate in the dialogue, let them explain to us how platforms make them feel, and then also give them a little bit more control about how they can take measures to protect themselves and avoid these types of deceptive designs. And although I've previously mentioned that we need to think about parents differently, that parents and socioeconomic and cultural differences mean that no two child is the same, we need to involve parents in the conversation as well. As we were talking in the break, many parents don't know that these tools exist, and so we can educate children about how they can prevent harm, and we can also empower parents to make parental choices. Now, that doesn't really help very young children, and I recognize that. But that's two classes of demographics of children that we could actively improve the present situation for. So hopefully that kind of brings that answer to a close. I would just think that we can't think of this as just a legislative thing. We can't just approach it from a technical point of view, or let's give some more platform controls or turn defaults off. We need to think about this more holistically and more broadly and get active involvement from all stakeholders to the problem. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Indeed, very useful and I think important that we bring in this perspective of the protection of children, since it is often the kind of focus that you see when talking about social media addiction. It's about protecting minors. And I wanted to also thank all the audience members for submitting many questions to us, and we will get to them right after some interventions, although some of the themes that I see there among the questions have already been reflected a bit. So, for instance, this call to have more precision in what we are talking about, and also about the different business models. It's not necessarily about some general ban across the board. There are different business models. There are social media platforms and other service providers, for instance. And there are also a number of questions about, indeed, the types of harms that occur and the extent to which they are empirically proven at the moment. I will now move on to continue on this regulatory perspective of what should be changed, turning back to Casper. So should consumers get some new rights concerning addictive design, or what should be the future regulatory response?
Thank you very much. There are two main dimensions to flag here. First is the core horizontal issues that need to be addressed. And by this I mean strengthening protection by design and by default. This is the discussion about fairness by design, a duty of care on the entities in control of our choice environments, but also those holding all the information. Closely related is the debate on the burden of proof that we've heard in the first panel. And updating the horizontal consumer law framework, which is already on the table in a sense. We discussed it extensively in our response to the consultation. We asked about writing engagement-based transactional decisions into the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive. This has also been mentioned already here today, and rightly so. Unfortunately, the guidance document is non-binding on the national court. It's an interpretation. In order for the UCPD to be applicable to these services, this should become law. We would still need to ask to update some core concepts of consumer law, of professional diligence, for instance. There is, as you know, it's part of the unfairness test for unfair commercial practices, and it's based on this presumption of this diligent operator, on how they would act in a given set of circumstances. The problem is that we have a handful of big platforms out there. None of them are exactly compliant. So it's very difficult to fully conceptualize how a diligent operator should act in this or other context. And you asked about rights. Sorry. Indeed, we tackle them as well in our framing response paper. We asked about the consideration of rights to consumers to counterbalance this disempowerment that we're discussing here. We asked for a right not to be tracked. As you know, it's virtually impossible to stay out of the data collection system. You will always, at some point, click I accept somewhere, and even if you don't, you will be tracked, even if you don't have a user account. We've already seen studies that platforms do this. Even if they theoretically allow you to use their services anonymously, they're still collecting data on you. Websites are not respecting the browser do not track setting. Right now, it's impossible to stay out of it, and we believe it should become a right. A right to meaningful personalization, another one we asked for. And this ties in closely to what's already been discussed here about the experience consumers have with these personalized services. Because what we see very often is, under the guise of personalization, we get self-serving optimization from the recommender system. They give us the promise is to give us something that's relevant. What we are given is something that will keep us scrolling, keep us clicking. And I couldn't be happier when I heard Francesco talking about the dedication to making it the best possible experience, because it's that experience that is currently being flagged as a problem. We see reports of body image problems, depression, suicidal content, self-harm content being pushed on children by some recommender systems. I'm sure they don't like their experience as it is, but they keep clicking because this is how these systems work. So I'm very happy that the discussion is heading in that direction. in that sense, for those platforms, I don't think it makes sense to even start discussing whether their intention is to get people addicted, just as it didn't make sense in the last century to discuss whether Philip Morris executives were planning to get people hooked on cigarettes. That's beside the point. The point is there are externalities to these services, to these business models that have to be taken into account in policymaking. So what else? We asked for a right to be free from personalization. We all need personalization, of course, in some services. This is why search engines work, is because they are personalized based on the data they have on us. But if somebody wanted, for instance, to stay out of getting personalized offers, they should have the right to do so. BEUC has a strong stance on personalized pricing, but that should be included as well. If I don't want to get personalized prices, I should be allowed to do so, to not get them. And lastly, we asked about explainable personalization. In our paper, we call this the digital alter ego, but it's actually broader than that. It's the right to get the explanation what is actually happening with our data when we are getting a personalized service. And by that I mean, if my insurance company is giving me a price quote that is based on my accident history, that's fine. Of course they would do that. It's their risk assessment. They have the right to do it. But if they're basing it on a whole range of data, including my children's search histories, then I should have the right to know that. Because then I would go to a different insurer who doesn't do that. And this is how you get good practices in the market. So there's a lot of work to do, but it's important to remember that horizontal consumer law, with its broad applicability, technological neutrality, potential for being future-proof, and we do need future-proof solutions if we stick to compartmentalization, as said here, and keep regulating use cases, we are regulating the past, because this is how quickly everything is changing. So an important toolkit, definitely to overhaul, but that can be put to good use. Thank you.
Thank you. Indeed, very comprehensive, and a lot of new ideas for new rights, which have not yet been mentioned by anyone before at this event. So I will now turn back to Brian, just for a follow-up question. You mentioned in your intervention earlier about this expert group on big tech that the Danish government commissioned. So building on those results, what should be the role of these big tech companies in tackling these issues?
Thank you. Yeah, we made this report, and the first, they made the report, and the government in Denmark agreed to all their recommendations. And the first report was about this business model. And I think it's important that it seems simple, but the business model is to collect as much data as possible from everybody, and to have them spend as much time as possible on their platforms. So when you ask, what should we ask from the big tech, what as Mr. Bondi said, what proactive approach could they have? I'm not too optimistic, because a lot of what we suggest will go contrary to that business model. They should have less data, we should have less time spent, and we should be less addictive on those platforms. So there's an issue here. But the report encourages many things related to the topic today. They specifically asked or encouraged big tech companies to turn off retention mechanisms like autoplay, infinitive scroll, and these notifications towards minors. So as the DSA looked at how can you actually profile minors and use that for targeted advertising and have a specific right on minors, that's what they suggest that these companies should do as well. But there's a problem with this. In Denmark, 70% of minors between 7 and 12 are on YouTube, whereas there's a requirement from YouTube themselves and from Google that you should be at least at the age of 13. So as long as we don't have any age verification, and it seems they don't know that children are actually on the platforms, how should they live up to this recommendation? But still, the recommendation is there. And then big tech companies should also require users to actually allow each individual function on social media. So we have this blanket user consent today. I'm a lawyer myself, but I think we invented something that we're actually capable of consenting to things. But at least if we get it more individualized, and it's not one consent to get data across the board. That might help. It will give some sort of user autonomy and self-determination on what to say yes and no to. But I think, yeah, as I started out saying, it's really important to remember that the business model is as the business model is. So asking big tech to do things, I'm not too optimistic on that. And then just one comment, I'll give you a call, Mark, because I think this holistic approach is really interesting and something that we also have to look into, not doing this piecemeal legislation on some of these issues. So thank you for that point.
Thank you. Indeed, on that note, let's pass the floor to the lucky representative of the big tech platforms. Just for the one final follow-up question, what should be the future regulatory response? And is the current legal framework clear enough for companies as for what is allowed and what isn't allowed?
No, thank you. Thank you for the question, and I will use my lucky status of being the last one to just react. So I'll take that one. So I think just one thing which I found really interesting was this whole discussion about consent and the whole tied it to the holistic approach. I think that's what we've been really advocating for, is we tend to look at these aspects, as Dr. Leiser said, in silos. So you have the consumer on one side, data protection on the other, internet, mental health on the other, and so on and so forth. I think here a lot of what's been mentioned about consent, potential issues there, and so on and so forth. For example, that's an ongoing discussion within the cookie pledge that Commissioner Reinders mentioned, which is currently happening. We have the Better Internet for Kids Strategy Plus, which is discussing the whole specificity of the potential dangers to minors and children. We have the Commission Mental Health campaign as well, which is part of the discussion. So again, I just want to very much agree and encourage the approach of the holistic, sometimes just to avoid these silos, because that's when you sort of conflict with other discussions that are currently ongoing. In terms of, just to touch upon the intention, I think I would disagree there. It is important. And I think tying into that, I think the evidence is important. I think as EU-wide, we sort of really pride ourselves in evidence-based sort of policy making, which I think is very much key, and I think everybody here would agree with me. So again, I think the intention, improving the intention, and just having the sufficient evidence and doing the homework is key. So that kind of brings me to my topic, and to answer your question, Egelin. From our side, we don't know, I think is the shortest question and the shortest answer. We won't come here today with a reaction of like we need no legislation at all, or we need new amounts of legislation at all. For us, it's too early, and there's a lot of homework left to be done. In the sense, we're not against legislation per se. All we're saying is that first we need the evidence, we need the discussions, and that's also where your evaluation comes in, so no pressure. We're very much looking forward to that. But just to kind of premise everything is, one, it's really important for us to consider, again, the current legislation. You also have the consumer acquis, which is part of a puzzle, but you also have other framework legislation that has consumers at their core. So looking at Digital Services Act, and there I would slightly disagree with Dr. Leiser. I think there are sort of mechanisms there on Article 35 that touch upon the well-being aspect, for example, in terms of systemic risks. There's the AI Act as well, which is currently being negotiated. So Dr. Leiser wrote a really interesting report actually on how we could use, for example, Article 5 in terms of subliminal nudging, for example. There's the GDPR, so on and so forth. So again, there's quite a few things there, which kind of portrays a congested landscape, which is not to say don't introduce any new legislation, don't modify it. It's just a question of we really need to be careful how we complement the existing sort of framework that we have. New legislation, that's great. It keeps us all in a job, I think. But, to what end do we need that new legislation if there's, I think, before it was mentioned quite a bit, if there's no enforcement, if there's no guidelines, if there's no cooperation, and so on and so forth. So that brings me to point number 2. I think we really need the evaluation from the European Commission. That's why I really support that exercise. We've been actively engaging with. And that's what we mean. There's more homework to be done. It's kind of difficult to start from the end of we need new legislation when the existing evaluation of the current legislation hasn't been completed yet. And therefore, sort of just to bring my last point, I think we want to be as constructive as possible. It's not a question of we don't want to engage in the debate. We very much do, and we're here for that specific reason. I think the main thing there is before we decide upon, what's the future regulatory response, is let's look if there's any existing gaps. And if there are, we'll be the first to engage in the debate and see how we can fill those gaps. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. So with that, we can also turn now to our audience questions, of which there were many. If we have a look at one common feature here, there are a lot of questions about data or evidence about harm resulting from addictive designs and the difficulties in proving such harm, and would this evidence hold up in court, and how should non-monetary harm be addressed, like some of the mental harms? So this is indeed a very pertinent question, and I would turn it back to the panel if anyone wants to react on that. So is there sufficient evidence out there, and do we even need this kind of causation between the harms caused and then practice? Is correlation sufficient, or is even the risk of something going wrong enough in your view? So who would like to step in?
Yeah.
Mark, please.
So I think this is a bit of a misconception that we need to have evidence. The European Union has in its Treaty of Functioning, Article 191, subsection 2, which creates the precautionary principle as a underlying foundations of European Union law. And I would challenge my friend to the left here on this claim that we need evidence, because you don't need, or you shouldn't be asking for evidence that a child has been harmed, because that comes after the fact. So you're creating a situation where if the justification for intervention is, oh, a bunch of children have been harmed, I think that's the wrong way to go about looking at this. I think what you do is you suggest, okay, is it likely or is it reasonable to suggest that there might be harms that come from these type of techniques being deployed on platforms, and then regulate from that starting point rather than waiting for scientific consensus that harm has actually happened to children in the first place. And I think that is, particularly when it comes to vulnerable groups, that should be the starting point from tackling this problem, not the other way around. Thank you.
Thank you. And Francesco, you also wanted to come in.
Please, yeah. So thank you so much, and I take your point, Dr. Leiser, about the precautionary principle. I think what's really important here is to distinguish, obviously, the precautionary principle is an important one when it comes to vulnerable sort of segments of society. That's one thing. And that's not to say that we shouldn't take action before we have the evidence. I think I've presented the examples of what industry has already done, where we see potential issues. So we have already started, I think way before this discussion started, I think we've already started working on those potential danger that we may see. What we need for evidence, I think, is for policymaking. And I think where the evidence is important, and again, there is no evidence, comes directly from research. So it's not me saying it, it's the researchers directly saying it. And I think what's important there is, where are the pain points? Where do we need to sort of intervene? Is it only prevention? I don't think it's only prevention, but that's one aspect. In terms of also, there's a discussion going on of the flow of where it's coming from. So does existing sort of issues augment the use of problematic social media, or is it problematic social media use that encourages sort of potential dangers in mental health? In terms of comorbidity as well, what kind of, let's say, impact do certain issues have on the use, and what kind of features impact do the features have on the mental health? So again, it's not to say we shouldn't act at all. That's I think we've proven that we have been acting. And I would disagree that it's against our interest. Again, it's very much in our interest to act, because if there are harms on our services and our platforms, we lose users. And obviously, that's definitely not what we want. Especially, we want to protect our user, make sure they have a good experience. Where the evidence is needed is therefore, where do we need to act? And that's really why it's important to look at the gaps, and then also look what researchers are telling us in terms of, okay, this you need to act more on prevention, or you need to act more on the platform side. And again, not to say maybe it is on the platform side, but again, research should tell us that. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. And as we are coming to the end of this panel, I'll just like to give the floor also to panelists on my right for any reactions to what was discussed, or any closing remarks from your sides.
I can go first. Yeah, but thank you for a good discussion. I much agree with Mark with the precautionary principle. There's a risk here, especially to our minors, and there needs to be reaction to that. Just one point, there was a question on this whole consent that I raised myself. I think we need, I don't have a mandate to say that we should change GDPR. I'll get sacked when I get home. But I don't know if we should, but we should at least look at or realize that we cannot consent. We cannot grasp, and there's just this asymmetry between consumers and traders, and we cannot grasp this, and especially not towards big tech. But we need to be there. That we're depending on, like you said, the whole communication, the whole debate is going on there. So we need to look, what can we not allow in Europe? What can we not allow to be able to protect our minors, but in general, the democratic society and the so I think we need to realize that consent is not working, and therefore we need to do something differently at least.
Thank you. Two quick points. One, I would like to follow up on the matter of harm and evidence. And one of the beautiful aspects of the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive is that it doesn't come after the harm has been done. It comes in before, and it looks at the likelihood of misleading the consumer, the likelihood of affecting or distorting their transactional decision. And there's a lot of discussion turning towards where's the harm, give us evidence of harm. Okay, but we have tort law for this. We don't need consumer law if we only look at what's already been committed, what's already been done. So this is why we're asking for that framework to be applied, to be updated, and this is why we're asking for fairness by design, which is how I want to react to the point on the holistic approach. We couldn't agree more. Yes, we have a lot of sectoral legislation. Yes, they are very good attempts at addressing specific issues. Sometimes the world changes too quickly, and they need to be adapted, as we've seen with AI Act and the emergence of generative AI in the meantime before the legislative process could be completed. And this is why it's so important for consumer law to work as the safety net. This is why we need that safety net in place. This is why we need these services to be fair by design, and designed by entities which have this duty of care, so that we don't have to compartmentalize consumers. We don't have to talk about age-appropriate design, introduce those artificial brackets above which it's fine to be doing these things to people. That's a little beside the point. And also, from a practical perspective, those of you who have kids, when I was a child and there was a limit imposed on anything that I found interesting, it was immediately open season to find and circumvent it. And I have every reason to believe that my kids are going to be doing the same thing.
Thank you so much. And with that, I will be closing this panel. I think the last interventions were really summing up some of our broader conclusions and takeaways very nicely, this need for a holistic approach, but also stressing the particular importance of consumer rights and consumer policy in this debate about addictive design. So thank you also to our audience for their very active engagement, and I will now pass the floor back to Isabelle Perignon for some closing remarks.
Closing remarks will be very short because we're all waiting, expecting the lunch where we can continue the discussion. The lunch will be taken into the format of a buffet that is on the 12th floor, so 12e étage. When you go outside the elevator, and we can guide you there, there's a reception room. And I wanted really to thank you all who followed this event here in the Parliament and online. I also wanted really to thank the signatories from the companies who are working for months and who came today to pledge. To the panel speakers, I mean, we had two very good panels, and a big thank you to the moderators, Egelina and Martins, who did that very professionally. And a big thank you to all of you who helped organize this. I have the E-Dream team here in my directorate, so thanks a lot for having organized this event. And thanks a lot for the Parliament and all the staff for hosting us today. We will certainly, follow up on this work. As you know, it's a crucial one, by keeping you really informed of what are the next steps on this digital fitness fairness check. And for all the questions that we couldn't take at the second session, we will obviously, read them, and they will be part of our work and reflection. So we stay in contact. Have a nice day, and don't forget, buffet is waiting for you outside. Thank you.